Thanks, Mayborn, for having us here today. I want to shout out the high school students. I think it's really amazing that you're here. You're definitely much further ahead of the game than I was when I was your age, so I'm really proud of you guys. So I started, my very first job out of graduate school was covering the Durham Public Schools in Durham, North Carolina for the Raleigh News and Observer. So I didn't dream to be an education reporter, but like all journalists who need a job, I took the first job that I got. And it just so happened to be covering a school district that was very segregated. This was about 2003. So for people who know education, this is when the penalty phase of No Child Left Behind was starting to kick in. And No Child Left Behind was basically saying, we're not going to try to break up poverty in schools. We're not going to try to break up segregation in schools. We're just going to test the hell out of these schools, hold them accountable, and if somehow poor black and brown schools don't get the same test scores as white schools, we're going to get rid of the principals, we're going to get rid of the teachers, we're going to, turn those schools around. And as a young reporter who's just learning about education, learning about No Child Left Behind, and spending a lot of time in these poor schools, it just very quickly became clear that there was no way you could take a school with 95% kids in poverty, not give them resources, because No Child Left Behind did not come with more money, it just came with more scrutiny. And suddenly get those students to get the same test scores as a rich white school. It just was very clear. So that's when I really started looking for, because I understood that low-income black children are not less intelligent, not less capable. So I really wanted to understand why we kept seeing this achievement gap. And that's what really got me interested in writing about school segregation, was just the research. At that time, I don't even think I realized I was part of a desegregation order as a child.
Because you were what, second grade?
I started in second grade. I was bused from second grade to 12th grade. And when you're a kid, you just get on the bus and go where your parents tell you to go to school. You don't ask why, you don't wonder why. So I wasn't until I was much older that I even realized, and after I was a journalist for a while, when I started doing some research in my own hometown, that I realized that was actually part of a desegregation plan.
And you said then in one of your stories that those were years when you were bused, those were years you described as emotionally and socially fraught, but also academically stimulating and world expanding. How so?
So I would not call, except for my high school, I wouldn't call the schools that I went to integrated. They were desegregated schools, but they were desegregated because there were a handful of black kids who were being bused into very, very heavily white schools. Not only were we a racial minority, but economically, we were a lot poorer than the kids at the school. So for that reason, it was very challenging. And for anyone who's been bused, you will know it's challenging because you get on a bus every day, you drive out of your neighborhood, you go to someone else's neighborhood where they may or may not want you, and at the end of the day, you get back on the bus and you go back home. That was just a hard experience. But I got the best public school education that my hometown offered. And I was able to get access to courses and instructors and to spend time with kids who were very different from the kids in my neighborhood. So I have no doubt, as brilliant as I am, I have no doubt
and modest, not forget modest,
that getting into that school helped me, set me on the path to be able to have the successes in life that I had. Because I have seen, I've written over and over again about brilliant black kids who are trapped in schools that don't educate them, and they are not most often able to escape their circumstance.
You know, you're right. You have written over and over and over again about this, right? And all of your stories, from the resegregation of Jefferson County, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, to your recent piece, I think a week ago in the Times about busing. And so where does your inspiration, your motivation come from to write these stories?
So realizing this is a journalism conference, I should just make it clear. I see myself more in the tradition of Ida B. Wells type of journalism, where I don't pretend to objectivity. I don't pretend to be objective about black kids being shuttled away in inferior schools. So honestly, a lot of my motivation is rage. Being real.
Angry black woman.
I'm definitely
syndrome.
the angry black
Okay,
woman.
all right.
If you're black in America, I feel like you have a lot of reason to be angry, justifiable. But I feel like if when I'm sitting in classrooms and going to schools where kids haven't had a math teacher for an entire year, where kids have never been assigned an essay, where kids, when I was in Detroit, kids would come in the morning and they would have to wipe the rat feces off their desks in the morning before they sat down. If you are a journalist and don't feel some sense of rage or outrage about that, then I would rather you report on something else. So it's not hard for me to find motivation. We're going to change mics.
Cheryl, I hate to interrupt. It's a great conversation. And could you just please speak directly into these? Okay, sorry about that.
Never give me a handheld mic. I will walk the floor and take advantage of it. So you want me to take this?
You can just leave it on.
Okay, perfect.
There, but please speak directly into it.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
He's the reason.
Blame that man. This is much better, though. This is much better. Thank you. Or thank that man. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's not an easy job. I appreciate it.
That's not. So that leads to my next question. Do you intentionally start out with a point of view when you do your reporting?
Yeah, of course. I mean, here's the thing. There's not a journalist, as you know, who doesn't start out with a point of view. And oftentimes, white journalists can pretend to be objective, particularly when they're covering race, because there's a belief that white is not a race, or white people don't come from a racial perspective. But of course, I have a point of view. I think when I do journalism, the thing that I always have in mind is, am I being accurate? Can anyone dispute the facts? And am I being fair to the various people in the story? But again, I'm not doing, someone asked me this earlier today, do I consider myself an advocate? I consider myself...
Are they here?
Yeah.
Who asked that?
I get that a lot, though. I get that a lot. I mean, people follow me on Twitter.
Is it because you have a point of view?
Yes, absolutely. But journalism has a point of view. And my answer always to that is I'm as much of an advocate as all journalists are advocates. That people get into journalism, you can go into newsrooms and they have a stated purpose, right? We want to hold power accountable. We want to tell the stories of the vulnerable. We want to right wrongs. That's not a neutral position. So yes, I do not have a neutral position about the things that I report on. I find neutral positions fairly useless. We can look at climate change coverage. Is it useful journalism to give climate change deniers the same weight in the story as 99% of scientists who say the climate change is real? Is that objective? I would actually say that's objectively wrong. So having a point of view, I think, is okay. Acknowledging your point of view is very important because that's your system of checks and balances to make sure that your reporting is actually fair. But I don't pretend to be objective. And the reporter who is uncovering wrongdoing at Child Protective Services, they want that wrongdoing to be fixed. That's why you're doing that journalism. That's not objective.
They walk in there wanting it to
exactly.
be fixed. Mm-hmm.
Now, you shouldn't go, there's a difference between a point of view and believing you already know the answers to the story. Believing, not actually reporting, but going in saying, this is what I'm going to find. Those are two very different things. But I think, how can you be a black woman in America who was bused herself, who lives in a segregated neighborhood, and then pretend none of those things will affect my reporting? How can you be a white person in America who's always had access to great schools, who has always had access to great neighborhoods, and not think that that impacts the way that you've covered this story?
And actually, you could work that to your advantage, right? Being a black woman, writing about desegregation schools, does it help you as a black female journalist to develop sources?
It helps and it hurts, right? Like all things. Certain people are more likely to want to talk to me, and certain people are less likely to want to talk to me. But I think that's the nature of the job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So your news analysis, I think it was July 12th, it was early this month in the New York Times, it was Never About Busing, that was the title, was Never About Busing, was an interesting take on a pivotal moment in the presidential debate between my sorority sister, Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden. Where did your idea to write this come from? Because you reminded me when I read this, and this is, you guys are so different, but oh my God, Kevin Merida, help me out. The fashion critic at the Post, Robin Gavon. Robin Gavon can take the most benign thing and turn it into an amazing story, right? Some little thing that nobody picked up on. And that's what you did with this. Where did the idea come from?
So one, like, I'm obsessed with school segregation. Like, I live and breathe school segregation. And so I'm always thinking about it. And in this particular case, I was just really frustrated with the coverage. I was really frustrated that every time you turned on the TV and there was a news story or a commentary about busing, it was, why did she bring this up? Because busing failed. And I knew that that wasn't true. Like, factually, you could just look at the data on it. You could look at what happened. And this speaks to your other question about point of view, right? So if I can write a 4,000-word article that breaks down point by point the fallacy of that, then any curious reporter can do the same thing. Any reporter who cares to know the facts. But it was conventional wisdom. So I wrote that article because I felt like I knew a history and facts that were not being reported. And I had enough space in the Times to do that. And literally, I actually wrote the article on Twitter first.
All 4,000?
No, I thought, I probably, if you added all, right, if you added all the tweets together. But I used this to tell my boss, who thinks I spend too much time on Twitter. I was like, see, this is why, because I'm working out my arguments before I actually write an essay.
Oh, that's good. Write that down, future journalists.
Exactly.
This is a good lesson.
But it was and people were asking me to weigh in because they just know that I know a lot about it. But if you read the story, the same thing that reporters were writing now was what reporters were writing about busing 40 years ago. And who is writing those stories? Who are education reporters? What do they look like? What type of experiences have they had? How would they feel if their children were now going to be reassigned in a busing program? If we think that all of those things don't impact the coverage, we're being very naive. But I'm coming not only from a different personal experience, but someone who actually has some expertise in the subject.
You mentioned a couple of points I was going to get to later. One of them is the coverage, right? And there was, when I came to the Post in '97, there was at least one person who covered race. It was Michael Fletcher, and Kevin, tell me if there was someone else I missed, and later it was Cheryl Thompson, right? Both African-American journalists and very good journalists. And it seems like now race, covering race and social justice issues just has all but been abandoned, except by people like you. Those beats aren't as prevalent as they once were, if they exist at all. So why isn't there more coverage of issues like this in publications and in radio and TV, except for when the President of the United States says things like, why don't you go back where you came from?
But then even that, it's racially infused, right? Like we use a lot of euphemism.
No, wait a minute, we in Texas, I'm just saying, okay.
You want me to talk about the Civil War? So why? I think because Obama got elected and racism was solved. There was no need to cover it anymore.
That's what newsrooms thought. That's what newsroom managers thought.
No, I mean, we know that mainstream newsrooms have never had a lot of interest in this as a beat. What you'll often hear is people saying, everyone should cover this, which is true. But then that also presumes that there's no particular expertise in writing about racial inequality and race and racism, which is not true. So I don't think it was a subject area that newsrooms wanted to invest in the first place. And then as budgets got smaller and newsrooms started to feel under siege, all things having to do with race were the first things to go. Diversity recruiting programs, minority internship programs, race beats, all of those things disappeared very quickly. And then you see the problem with that because Okay, Obama ushers in the post-racial society, which lasts exactly 8 years, and then we get someone who some people would call as a white nationalist in the White House. So I think my main issue, because there are, I mean, the Times has a race reporter, AP has a race reporter, I don't know if the Post has a race reporter, but there's certainly reporters at the Post who are writing about race, is that the beat of racial injustice is a beat. Just because you're black doesn't actually mean you're gonna be good at it. It helps, maybe, but those who are very good at writing about racial inequality are very good because they study the hell out of it. They have a great deal of expertise. It's not just some sense of osmosis that I will know how to cover segregation, that I will know how to cover racism in the criminal justice system because Cousin Pookie went to jail. It doesn't work like that. So I think it's important that this beat be treated as an area of actual expertise, and that writers, no matter what their races are, there are some very great white reporters who, I mean, Emily Badger, for one, I think does a great job, but that's because she's an expert in it.
So what advice can you offer writers wanting to tackle issues of race and social justice? For there are a lot of writers here. What advice do you give them?
I mean, it kind of piggybacks on my last answer. You need to develop expertise. If I'm going to be a science writer, I need to actually learn something about science. I need to read widely about science. I need to have a lot of scientists in my Rolodex. I need to have an understanding of how science actually works. We've all had, as journalists, had to write about something that we didn't have a lot of expertise in, and that writing's never very good. I'm writing about something right now that I'm just learning about, and it's not very good. I'm gonna have to keep working on it because I don't have the dexterity with something that I'm just learning. That's often the way that we are covering race, without the dexterity to be able to do it really well. So if you want to write about it, I mean, I ask education reporters all the time, how many of you have read Brown v. Board of Education? Most have not. How have you not read the most pivotal ruling for education that the Supreme Court has ever made? How have you not read what the law requires? How do you not know that every federal agency has a civil rights department, right? So these are basic things that if you were covering any other beat, you would make sure that you know. But I think we get very lazy when it comes to writing about racial inequality. We think that we can just write about a bunch of studies that says black people suffer from this, black people suffer from that. That's not breaking news. We know that. Whatever you can measure, except osteoporosis, I've checked. That's the only thing that white people suffer from more than black people.
Let me sit up straight.
I've literally
Be
checked.
a statistic.
It's the only thing I found. But just listing that these disparities exist is not useful reporting, because what the average American does is fill in the blanks with their minds about why that is, and it always comes back to the same thing, which is the pathology of black people. But when you actually dig and you can show the structures and the architecture that has created the inequality, and you can show the intentional decision-making that is happening, then that's how you can actually change people's minds and lead to solutions, which I think none of us get into journalism because we want to be stenographers. We get into journalism, most of us, because we want to make a difference.
Do you think that in this 24-hour news cycle that journalists, particularly young journalists, are less likely to do the research to learn about a subject than we did, and that we still do?
I mean, I wouldn't say just young journalists. I think there's a lot of shitty journalism being made by a lot of journalists of different ages.
No, how do you really feel?
I mean, you know what? I always hate when I get like these questions because then I feel old and then I realize I'm actually getting old, so whatever. But I think I'm thankful that I didn't come of age in journalism right now, in some ways. I get a lot of, this is younger journalists, and the first question they'll ask me is, how do I build my brand? And I'll be like, brand around what? You have nothing to build a brand around, right? If you're journalism, it is the journalism that builds the brand, not your name. But I think because of the society that we're in right now, it's the inverse. I never clearly thought about building a brand because we didn't have social media to build a brand on. Your brand was gonna be, if you wrote really, really well, someone might recognize your byline, and that was it. And most people don't even read the bylines of any stories that are written. And so there's because of that, And because I think also the digitization of journalism, you don't have a lot of spaces where young journalists can go at the Baltimore Sun and cover school board meetings every single day and learn how to source, learn how to read a budget, learn how to do actual journalism. What they're having to do is sit at their desk and make some phone calls and aggregate some news and put out stories. That's just a different thing. And when you tell young journalists, actually, don't start Alpha in New York working for Mike, go work at the Baltimore Sun, most of them are not interested in that advice.
And it's good advice, because I started out at the Champaign, Illinois News Gazette, where I went to school, and I wouldn't have trained. All right.
Okay, Champaign. I mean, I started out, my first job was at the Chapel Hill News, which was a twice-weekly newspaper. I worked there. I worked my way from there to the News and Observer, from there to the Oregonian, and then I came to New York. And I'm not saying, like, I'm not one of these people who believes you have to, you know, go through some hierarchy first. Like, if you're very talented, jump wherever you can jump, but you actually have to be talented, right? And you actually have to have the skills. And everyone has thoughts about things, but can you do journalism? Can you get people to talk to you? Can you find and track down records? Do you know how to make a FOIA request? Again, can you read and decipher a budget? That's different than just saying, I feel this way about something. And the journalism we need right now, we need substantial journalism. That's what we clearly need. Thank you. I don't like when people say, like, we're more important than ever. This is the, you know, worst times ever. Like, I'm black, it's been way worse times than this. And journalism has always been necessary. This is not, you know, the worst crisis this democracy has ever faced. These are not the worst times. But it is crucial, right? It is critical. And in some ways, when news has been democratized because there's more outlets than ever, there are more ways than ever for people to get the word out. But in some ways, that's also been harmful because people are much more segmented. And they're not necessarily getting or believing the news that they need to be getting or believing. Which wasn't even your question, but I just went on a tangent.
But that's
Sorry.
okay, because not only is it that you have to be a good journalist, but you know, I tell my students at George Washington that you need, it's also learning about the politics of a place and making mistakes at smaller places so that when you get to a place like the Post or the Times or the Wall Street Journal, you don't make those mistakes. Because my students want to start out at the Post, and I'm like, do you know how long it took me to get to the Washington Post? I had to go through Kansas City and the Chicago Tribune and the LA Daily News and the Champaign News Gazette to get there, and I think I was ready. I guess I'm still deciding, but you know, so it's about good journalism, but it's also about the politics of it, being able to handle what is thrown your way.
It's funny because, I mean, I'm in a newsroom now where some of the people who are covering the election, oh damn, what I do now? That was Donald Trump, he cut me off. Right, they're like 25 years old.
He's gonna deny it.
Right, exactly. And I think that's amazing because when I was 25 years old, I was still a graduate student. I was interning when I was 27. I was working, you know, as an intern and at selling mattresses on the side. And I think it's amazing that there are journalists who have the confidence and the skills at that age to be in a place like the New York Times and do good journalism, because that was not me. And I think about that a lot because I think had I come into a place like the Times that young, no one would probably know my name. I don't think I would have been able to do the type of journalism that I was able to do from the first day I got at the Times. But then I'm also like, if the Times had called me at 25, I would have fucking went, clearly, right? Like, it's not like I would have been like, you know, I just need to spend some time in Oregon for a while or North Carolina. Like, I would have gone, but I am grateful for the experience of really, because when I was, my first job at in North Carolina, I could ask my editor and say, I don't actually know how to do this. I want to write this story. How do I do this? If you're at the Times, you better know. And if you don't know, you're going to pretend that you know. And you don't do good journalism when you're pretending that you know. And when you're a person of color on top of that, they already don't think you deserve to be in the places that you are. We don't get to make mistakes. We don't get the benefit of the doubt. And so I see a lot of younger journalists, I think, who are afraid to even admit the things that they don't know, but if you've only been doing it 2 years, you can't know as much as someone who's been doing it for 10, right? This is a craft. These are skills. They build on each other. So if you can make it into a place that early, I'm proud of you. But I just don't want young journalists to think that that is always the place that you have to start. And don't spend so much time comparing yourself to your peers. When I was at the High Point Enterprise, my peers were interning and getting jobs at the LA Times, what was their program called? MetPro. Or they were at all of these big places, and I felt very inadequate because I was at, does anybody know where the High Point Enterprise is? Okay, journalists, newspaper journalists.
Journalists, we know.
High Point, North Carolina, very small. But in the end, it worked out well for me, right? So don't always, you can't look to what other people are doing, and you can't always think starting off in the big pond, because you will be a little. You will be a small fish. Places are very cutthroat, as you know, and you may not be able to do the journalism that you really want to do. And this is always a question I ask. Mostly it's young journalists who ask me for advice. Older journalists don't need advice from me. But I'm like, why do you want to be a journalist? Do you want to be a journalist so you can say that you work somewhere? Or do you want to be a journalist because you want to do certain type of work and certain types of stories? And oftentimes, the way that you can, places that you can do the work that you really want to do are the smaller places that need you to do the work that you want to do.
I had a student, I'll tell a quick story. I had a student who was very good. He was a really good writer. For some reason, the boys were my better writers. I don't know why. Sorry, girls. They were. And this young man was really talented. And he just had to go work for the Wall Street Journal. They offered him a job in video. And he was like, Professor, I want to take this job. I'm like, I think it's a mistake. But, you know, the dollar signs and everything. 2 years, I took him to lunch. He wanted to go to lunch. I paid for lunch because he was struggling. 2 years later, he came back and he said, Professor, can we have lunch? So I went to lunch with him. He says, I don't really like it there. I want to go. I think I want to go into television, and I have an opportunity at some small station in Wyoming. Wyoming. From the Wall Street Journal to Wyoming. He is as happy. I made him pay for lunch, by the way, because he had a job then. And he's as happy as he could be because he's a big fish in a small pond. He's an anchor. You know, he has a Wall Street Journal experience.
He can do the work that he wants to do.
That's right. He can do the work that he
I
wants
just
to
recently advised, she's not a young journalist, but she's certainly younger than me, which means she's young, because I'm very young. But she works at a big digital newsroom in the city. She has a very fancy title. But she went to one of my Ida B. Wells workshops. She wants to be an investigative reporter, and she's like, I can't nobody is going to develop me in a job like that to do that type of work. So I told her to go to the Baltimore Sun. She just interviewed there. She actually did it. She's like one of my few success stories of telling someone to leave a big market to go to a small market. And she wants that job so bad because she really just wants to do journalism. And that's the difference. Like, why are you getting into the business? I think that's the biggest question. I actually never aspired to work at the New York Times. I never applied at the New York Times. I just wanted to work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to write about black folks in the South, and they never hired me.
Well, that's funny. And I always wanted to work at the New York Times, and I spent 22 years at the Post because the New York Times never hired me.
Okay, well.
So there you go.
And we both turned out just fine.
We turned out okay. So because let's go back to the race, and it can be a touchy subject, as we all know. We talk about race, people squirm, and we make them uncomfortable. How easy is it to get your editors, most of whom I assume are white, to buy into that, to buy into your story? Well, you might be a little different because you've proven yourself, but overall.
Yeah, so it's easy now, but it was not always easy. People who know me know that, what year is this? About 7 years ago, I almost left journalism altogether because I was working, just to be clear, I only ever wanted to be a journalist to write about race. I've never been one of those black journalists who didn't want to be pigeonholed. I didn't find it to be a pigeonhole. I wanted to write about race. And in America, you can write on any beat you want, and unfortunately, no matter what you're covering, race is there. But I went to a newspaper who, when they hired me, knew that I wanted to write about race ostensibly hired me to write about race, and then had a problem with it the entire time I was there, and made it very, very difficult, said that because I wanted to write about race, I was being biased, that I was wanting to write about black people too much. This is when Obama was running for president, and even then it was too much. And I had this moment of, and this is also the same time that kind of the bottom was falling out of the newspaper industry, and there wasn't anywhere else to go. If you had a job, you better keep that job. And I really didn't know if I couldn't write the stories that I got into journalism to write, if I wanted to do journalism anymore. And the only reason I'm still here is I couldn't bring myself to leave journalism, because I've wanted to be a journalist since I was in high school. I wrote my first and got my first letter to the editor published when I was in middle school. I subscribed to Time magazine as an elementary school student. Like, I've always loved journalism and the news, and here I found myself feeling like I might have to leave the industry because I wasn't going to be able to do what I do. Luckily, though, I got hired at ProPublica, and when I had the conversations with Steve Engelberg about me coming there, I made it very clear I'm not going to come if I can't do this work, because I'm already in a place where I can't do the work that I want to do. And again, just moving to a bigger name publication was not important to me. Writing about the things that I thought was important was what was important to me. And since then, I mean, just really being liberated to do the work that I wanted to do is why I'm now able to do this work. So now, no, whatever I say that I want to write about, I can write about it, which is kind of an amazing place to be.
It is. How do you handle pushback from people who read your stories and feel like you're opening old wounds and stirring the pot, so to speak, the race issues?
I don't care.
How did I know that? How did I know that?
I don't care. I really don't. I read 5 comments down on anything that I write, just enough to get a tenor of what's in there, and I don't have to read further than that. I don't care. Like, people, I get a lot of email. As long as you're not calling me out of my name, I'll respond, but I'm not gonna argue with you. Either you can dispute the facts or you can't, and I don't spend any time thinking about that really at all, because the racial tension is there, whether I write about it or not. And this idea that as long as black folks are quiet about their suffering, then there's peace. As you know, Dr. King called that a negative peace, right? He said people want peace without justice. And I'm not a civil rights activist, but that is the way that
or an advocate.
Think about it, is what I'm writing is true. The facts that I'm writing about are true. And I hope that you're uncomfortable. I hope that when I tell you that black kids in Detroit can't get a textbook, but 2 miles across the municipal line in Grosse Pointe, they have imported Italian marble floors in their schools, I hope that makes you uncomfortable. I hope that it makes you upset, because we should not be accepting these things. And this timidity in reporting and writing about race is the reason why we come up with, our job is precision, but we come up with 30 different euphemisms to describe a president who has embraced white nationalism. We need to that's not an opinion. That's based on the factual definition of what white nationalism is. I think we need to just be more comfortable using language that is clear and precise and is accurate, and not being so worried about what's in someone's heart. Don't really care. Doesn't matter.
Because my bottom line is, well, they're reading. And at the end of the day, isn't that what matters? They're reading it.
Well, usually the headline.
Really?
I mean, if anybody's ever looked at Chartbeat, people are spending like 30 seconds in any article that you have, so don't look at Chartbeat.
Which is really bad for investigative reporting, right?
I mean, 9 times out of 10, if you read the comments, if you read the emails, the things that people are saying are about things that were not in what was not in the piece that you wrote. Or they're asking questions. Well, why didn't you talk about this? Well, it's in the 3rd paragraph. So I think a lot of people aren't reading very deep, and when they see a headline or they see something across their Twitter feed, they read the summary, and they know it's about race, and so then they want to say something ridiculous. I mean, yeah, this is gay rights, race, right? These are immigration. Those are the three things where every time you write about them, people lose their mind. You could probably add abortion into that too. And that's fine, but our job is to do the best reporting that we can. And I think if you spend a lot of time thinking about the racist people who comment on your things, I already drank a lot of bourbon. I don't need to be drinking more.
Neat, by the way, bourbon neat.
Yeah,
right?
neat. I can't be wasting time on ice cubes. By the way, whoever brought me that drink brought me scotch. Who was that?
We know who it was, but we're not gonna point him out. Neil, where are you going? Where are you going?
I was very offended by that. I'm just
It
gonna put
wasn't
that out
Neil.
there.
It really wasn't. As someone who often writes about subjects that a lot of folks don't want to be reminded of, how do you craft a narrative that isn't cliche, but at the same time capture readers' attention?
That's a good question.
I thought so.
I mean, I think we all struggle with that. Someone was asking me, a reporter was asking me earlier, do I ever miss not being a beat reporter? And mostly no. It's a tremendous luxury to have months and months and months to report something and, thousands of words that you can write. But it's also a lot of pressure and it's really hard. Because one of the things that I realize is, one, people, when you're writing about race, people think they already know the story, just like with busing, right? Why do I need to read this? I already know the story of busing. I would say 80% of the emails I got after that story was people who actually read it and said, oh my God, I didn't know any of this history. So I'm thinking all the time about, those of you who, bless you, has actually read my work because it's very long, then you know that 2/3 of anything I write takes place in the past. I spend a lot of time in the past in my stories because I don't think you can get Americans to understand modern racial inequality without first building in that architecture, because we just have so much amnesia about the intentional ways that inequality has been created. So if you're gonna do that though, you better have a hell of a narrative. So I'm always thinking about who's the story. I'm thinking about what's the structure of the story that provides enough tension, that is helping the past seem real and vibrant and alive. I think one of the times I did that, and I think the thing that I rely on when I'm doing that is focusing on figures both from the past and the present. So when I did Segregation Now, about resegregation in Alabama, I knew when I decided to do the story that I wanted to find a family of 3 generations. That if I was gonna take you all the way back to 1950, I needed to make every year of that real. And to do that, I was gonna tell the story of the grandfather who went through segregation, the mother who went through integration, and then the granddaughter who was back in segregation. And using the family as kind of the archetype to get you through the story, I hoped would allow me to actually create a real narrative, and people would stick with the past because the past was attached to a real person who is alive right now. That's what I also did with Jefferson County. So you have, the modern situation, but then you have this judge who grew up in segregated Alabama, was the first judge on that desegregation order 60 years ago, and is now finding himself in his twilight years having to defend this 60-year-old case that he originally brought. That's like a great narrative way to tie the past to the present and to give the past urgency in the present. So those are the things that I'm always thinking about.
And I want to talk about that story. That was one of my favorite stories of yours, is the resegregation of Jefferson County, Alabama. If you guys haven't read it, it's really good. It was on school succession in Alabama and included this amazing research on the state's resistance to school integration, including the creation of segregation academies and pupil placement laws. How did you come up with this idea? And I got to tell you, I learned so much about I cringed throughout this story as I was reading. I was like, oh my God, like really? Like this really happened? And I mean, the research was amazing. So how did you come up with this idea?
So this is again, the beauty of being a long-form reporter is, some daily reporter writes a story about a lawsuit, which is what happened, and then I look at that story and I'm like, oh, this is a bigger story if someone has time to spend on it. So there was reporting on that because the federal judge in that case actually decided to take the desegregation order seriously, which never happens. And the lawsuit provided just this amazing narrative because, in 2019, most white Americans know not to be explicitly racist when they decide that they want to break off their school district. They know enough to use language that camouflages it, but this community did not. So you
don't tweet it.
Right? Don't tweet it. Don't do it on Facebook. It was kind of the roadmap for how to get caught. So I knew that just from seeing this daily story and then reading the lawsuit that this was a story that I wanted to tell. And then I'm able to spend, months of time just reading and researching. But also, it's the beauty of having a beat. My beat is the segregation beat. I just know a lot about it. That busing piece I did, I wrote it in one day. I just sat down and I just wrote it because I know everything in that story. I didn't have to read. I didn't have to research. That expertise, it takes a long time to get, which is why I'm always much more timid when I'm writing about other subjects because I just don't know them as well. So that was really what happened with that. I just read, tons of lawsuits. I got to spend lots of time talking to different people. I knew a lot about Alabama's resistance to segregation because I had written about Alabama when I did the story in Tuscaloosa, but I also just know a lot about it generally. I think what I love about that, though, is people just don't know that history. They don't know the lengths that white Americans went to keep even one black child from attending school with a white child. They don't know that, Prince Edward County shut down public schools for 5 years. That's insane. Unless you know America, then it's not insane. So if you don't understand that history, though, then when we look at our schools now and we say, well, why are schools still segregated? We can have, clean hands. We can pretend racial innocence and say that it has nothing to do with the motivations of the past. But when you understand how violently segregation was resisted, then everything else is in a proper context. And we can see that the segregation now is just a continuance of that legacy. And that's what so much of your more daily race reporting misses. I think about when reporters were covering Freddie Gray's death.
In Baltimore.
Now, I knew, because segregation is my beat, that Baltimore had recently settled a lawsuit where City of Baltimore, the County of Baltimore, and HUD for discriminating against black folks and segregating black people in the City of Baltimore. That's relevant, because Freddie Gray lived in a segregated neighborhood that was intentionally created by the government. If you don't study segregation as a beat and you're not that curious, you cover the story as if Freddie Gray just happened to get lead poisoning one day and get in the back of that truck and get killed. There were a lot of things that led up to that. And if you don't offer the proper context, then white Americans look at that as this was just a thug who got killed. If you offer the proper context, then you trouble that narrative about what happened there. And the reporting is just so much richer because, again, why are we writing if we're not getting people to actually better understand their world?
And that goes back to researching and studying and really knowing your beat and taking an interest in it. And because it's there, all the information is there. You just have to read it, find it and read it, and you become an expert on the subject. So thank you for this. I think we want to open up to questions. I just kind of took over. Neil's coming back up. Now you come back.
Okay, Sharon DeBerry here. First, a comment. I, too, was one of those individuals who got to integrate my school as a kindergartner. I lived in Philadelphia, and my mother went to the Board of Education along with a good buddy of mine, and we're still friends today. But our parents went to the Board of Education and requested that we be able to go to the Jewish school across town. And that was prior to students being bused into that particular campus. And so I am grateful because it really changed my life having that opportunity, and it made me see the world in a different way. And so as I mentor young people in high schools now, you know, I see how sheltered, how closed so many of the students are. And the challenge is trying to open their worlds up, you know, so that they can even think about things like going to college, because so many of these kids do not even see that on the horizon. It's not something that's a possibility in their world. And so that becomes the challenge, is getting folks to lean in with our students and giving them an opportunity to see the world in a different way. What do you have to offer?
Thank you for your comment.
Okay. Great.
Well, I used to live in Winona, Texas, which was known as a black town. And I didn't know when I moved there that they had the second largest commercial hazardous waste injection well facility in the country, and the children were literally dying. I was the only one, I was a writer, and I was the only one that had a fax machine, a cell phone, and the ability to reach out to the press. So I started sending out press releases. The press saved us. We closed the facility. It was owned by a politician. My question is this: because the schools in the town, it was a poor black town, were horrid. I had to get involved with the school because they had the children learning next to the buses, where the fumes were literally coming into the classrooms. I don't understand, in a nation as rich as ours, why all schools can't get the same funding, wherever they are, so that every child, with every child, no child will get left behind. That is the only way. You have to give them the funding to get the teachers to have clean environment to learn, a non-dangerous environment to learn. You can't learn when you're hungry, and you can't learn when you're in filth, and you can't learn without good teachers.
All I'll say to that is amen.
Okay. Excellent. We have a question over here.
First, I just want to say thank you for what you do. It really does matter. Previous comments that I've heard you make made me believe that your opinion on magnet schools is that it is a tool that is currently used to further segregation in the public school system. So I have two questions. One is there if we eliminate testing for those types of schools, does that diminish that impact on further segregation with the assumption that the testing often diminishes the opportunity for minority students to get into those schools? If it's a lottery system, do you see that as a mechanism by which those schools could be better integrated? And just in general, in our society in which we are segregated and where we live, how do we create integrated school districts?
Thank you for the question. So this, again, is where history is instructive. So the common narrative is that magnet schools were created as voluntary desegregation programs, which they were, but they were created during the Reagan administration, who wanted to end forced school desegregation by court order. And so he implements this program of magnets so that we don't actually have to have court orders that were forcing communities to do what they didn't want to do. We can instead just draw small numbers of white parents into schools through magnet programs. My primary problem with magnet programs is the very notion of a magnet is that if you want white parents to come, you actually have to have a really good school. And that really shitty schools are just fine as long as black kids are going there. That's the whole basis of the magnet program, because you put in these amazing programs and you put in all this additional funding to get white parents into a school. That is demeaning to black kids. And what often happens, look in New York City, right? Our magnet schools would be our specialized high schools. You have a city that is 70% black and Latino where 9 black students get into the most prestigious public high school in the country. That sends the same message of segregation as just having black kids in all black schools. So that's my main opposition to magnets, is I think the whole idea behind them is that black kids weren't deserving of those schools, black kids weren't deserving of those funding, and you can make them more equal, certainly. Eliminating the test won't do it. If folks want a certain type of kid in a magnet school, they'll get a certain type of kid in a magnet school, whether they use testing or not. They'll say you have to interview in person. They'll say you have to submit a portfolio. They'll say you have to have a certain grade point average. There's lots of ways that we recreate segregation if we really want to. I don't actually believe in specialized schools at all. I think that in a public system, all schools should be open to every student in the public, and they should all provide the same education. You don't have to clap. Most people don't agree with me. That's fine.
It's wonderful hearing you speak, and I'm awed at your expertise in segregation. I have a question. It seems to me that the original sin of our schooling is that it's based on property taxes. So each little enclave of wealth can make a wonderful little school to serve its children. How far up in size do you have to go before you have total equality? Should the public school system be administered on a national level? Should it be administered on a state level? I mean, obviously, having it be a neighborhood school is not working because the neighborhoods are so different. Do you have any observations about that?
Yeah, so one, school funding by property tax is clearly a driver of inequality, but it's not usually by neighborhood because property taxes are issued by municipality. So within communities, every school is being funded by the same property tax, but you go out to the suburbs and they're able to raise more money for their kids, and actually usually with a lower tax rate because they have low tax rate on high property values, and in many cities you have a very high tax rate on low property values. And so not only are poorer cities not able to raise as much money, but poorer citizens are paying higher taxes in order to try to fund their schools. So the problem is the Supreme Court ruled in the 1970s that there's no constitutional right to an equally funded education. It actually upheld unequal funding in schools. States have ruled very differently. States have actually ruled, there's no constitutional right to an education federally, but most states mandate an equal education in their state constitution. So there has been some positive rulings around funding in the courts, but almost no enforcement of those rulings. So yes, I think that school funding should be equalized. I don't think that certain communities should be able to raise a lot of money for, and actually not even equalized, right? If you're gonna have kids coming from high poverty neighborhoods and going to schools where 90% of kids are poor, they don't need the same funding as a rich white school. They need more funding, clearly. So I think that you should have federal funding. But I also think our focus on property values helps us not to have to deal with the issue of race. Because if we think that the only thing driving inequality is property values, then you have to deny a place like New York City or Chicago or Philadelphia, where there's a great deal of segregation within the school district, and that has nothing to do with property values at all. So I think property values and local funding for schools matter, but even if you fixed all of that, we would still have a great deal of inequality in our schools. Another big thing, of course, is PTAs. So in a place like New York City, every school might get the same amount of funding, but my daughter's school in a good year, our PTA will raise $3,000. A mile down the road, at a very wealthy public public elementary school, they can raise $500,000 in a good year. That buys more assistants in the classroom, that buys art programs, that buys a lot of things that poor schools can't get. But if you want to see progressive people get really angry, talk about equalizing public schools. Because a lot of people actually don't want equality in public schools. They want their kids to have advantage.
So, question back here, and then we have a question in the front.
Oh, okay. Hi, I wanted to ask about something that I've struggled with. I've been a journalist for about 3 decades.
Where are you?
What's that?
Where do you work?
Right now, I'm a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times.
Okay.
I started at 21 at the Wall Street Journal, a decade there, a decade at the LA Times, and Latina. And I wonder how you deal with controversial subjects within racial or ethnic groups. In LA, where I live, more than half are brown. And I felt that the LA Times basically ignored the brown community overall, but that also Latinos and other journalists should deal with topics that were controversial within that community. So I once wrote a series about Latinos, how Mexican Americans had the highest rates of problem drinking of any group in the United States. This created a raft of shit at the LA Times. There was a section of brown people at the LA Times who felt we should only write positive stories about brown people. And I actually had a fight with the #2 editor at the LA Times to get this piece published. And so I felt that we should always write about brown people, but that you can't tackle big problems unless they are brought to light. But many people disagreed strongly with me with that point of view. And this came up again listening to the debate about Kamala Harris, where there was a debate. I lived in Miami with the Wall Street Journal, and we had a lot of Haitians in Miami and Haitian Americans in Miami. And many African Americans in Miami said, those Haitian kids who are born here, they're not real African Americans. And I see this at many universities that I travel to, like UNT, where they'll hire a professor who is Kenyan, who is given that slot as a diversity candidate in whatever part of the college. And I hear from the African American professors saying, this shouldn't be that way because they don't deserve that slot. I'm throwing a bit of a bomb into the room maybe, but I'm just wondering how you struggle with those issues and covering these issues.
Okay.
I don't. So a couple of things. It's all about context and nuance. And we want to write about race in such a simplistic way, and it is not. So the black community, there is none. There are black communities, and they are different, and they have very different experiences. And the experience of a black person who chose to immigrate here is clearly very different from black people who were brought here to serve under chattel slavery. And it is okay to write a story that acknowledges that, but you have to have enough knowledge and reporting and context to write that nuanced story, where it's not just presented as, look at these black people not being unified, this is a silly difference. It's not a silly difference, it actually matters. Like if you look at university numbers, you know that their rising numbers of black students are largely children of African immigrants or African immigrants. That matters, right? Because these are children who are coming in with a certain advantage over black Americans who were here as slaves. So it's fine. I think even with the story, I get frustrated a lot with coverage because I just think it's very simplistic. There was a story about Asian Americans who were challenging affirmative action at Harvard and posed it basically as the model minority story. It didn't actually get into the fact of of immigration, that most Asian immigrants do not come to the United States until after 1965 when we end racial quotas, that have never had to live under a system of legal discrimination in this country, that come here often on work visas and on education visas, so even if they're low income, they come from higher education households. All of this context matters and it's all knowable. So we need to stop being lazy. About the story about Latinos, I get both sides of that. If I haven't seen a story about brown people in the newspaper in 2 months, and the one story I see is about how Mexicans drink a lot, I'm gonna have a problem with that even if that is a true story. Because if there's a story about white people drinking a lot, there's an entire newspaper stories about white people. That does not then become a story about white people. So we do have to constantly be thinking about our coverage and what are the impacts. No, I don't think we should only write quote unquote positive stories. We need to write stories that are true, but we also cannot pretend that whatever we think this truth is happening in a vacuum. We know who the readers are. We know that these are readers who, if the only story they've seen about Mexicans in the last 2 months is Mexicans drinking a lot, they're gonna be like, of course they do. I know that that's what they do. That's how they are. That's dangerous. So it's healthy to have those conversations and debates. And it's important to have brown people and black people in the rooms when those conversations are happening so that we can push back and we can ask questions. And then ultimately you make a decision, and if you get shit for it, you do. But at least you know that it was a well thought out decision and you can actually defend what it is that you did. I just think in general, I would just like to see much more complicated, nuanced, well-researched stories about race that show that we actually know what the hell we're talking about, and most of the time, we don't.
We got a question back, and then we'll come to you, George.
Hi, Nikole.
Hey, I met you in the Delta
I'm
line
Moni.
today.
I'm the person who was sitting in front of you on the flight today to Dallas. I had a process
was there a
question.
story there? Did something happen?
Later.
Probably just me yelling at my daughter.
I had more of a process question for you. As a journalist who's covered race and segregation in schools for such a long time, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it was like for you to write the New York Times Magazine piece about your daughter, a first-person piece, and if you could talk a little bit about whether or not you had to make a pivot there to write as a mom and as a human being, more as a journalist in that piece, and what that entailed.
A woman of color.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So that piece was never supposed to happen, and I never intended to write. I mean, when my husband and I decided to enroll our daughter in a segregated school, we didn't do it because I thought one day I would write about it. We did it because I just felt it was the right thing to do. And then it just so happened that that segregated school becomes embroiled in an integration battle that no one could have foreseen. And all of these people, because they know I am obsessed with segregation, are messaging me and writing me and saying, oh my God, do you see what's happening in this school in Brooklyn? Are you gonna write something about it? Of course, they don't know that my daughter's in the school in Brooklyn. And I wasn't gonna write about it. But again, so much, honestly, of my coverage is driven by my frustration of coverage, where I'll see the way the stories are being covered, and I just think the coverage is so inadequate that I want to weigh in. And it's not even saying that the reporters who are writing the coverage aren't good, but they have 2 days, and I can take months on something, and it's just a different level of storytelling that you can do when you do that. So I went to my editors, and I was like, I think I want to write about my daughter's school. And then I changed my mind. But as you know, when you tell your editors about a good story, there's no changing your damn mind. Because I didn't want, so most people could read my reporting and have an idea, a very probably clear idea of where I stood on the issue. But it's one thing for people to be able to surmise that, and it's another thing for you to just tell people explicitly. And that's what this piece was going to end up ultimately having to do, is me just laying my cards on the table and saying that this thing that is on my beat, this is what I feel about it. That's a very fraught area to be, and I had conversations with my editors at the, and one, I'm a magazine writer, so there's more freedom than if I were a newspaper reporter. But I had conversations with my editor about what would that mean the next time I want to, and I think I did pay for that. Like when I did the story on Jefferson County, there were certain folks who just would not talk to me. Now, maybe they wouldn't talk to me because I was at the New York Times, or maybe they wouldn't talk to me because they felt a lot of the coverage had been unfair to them. But of course, I'm also wondering, they don't want to talk to me because they read what I wrote, and they know how I feel about this. And that's a dangerous area to be in when you're a reporter. In terms of process, if you read the story, it's first person, but it's not, right? So most of the story is not about me and my family. Most of the story is about the history of New York City and school segregation and what happened with these parents when they were fighting integration of the school. And then kind of for narrative continuity, we pop in and out of the story. Mostly we're in the story at the very beginning when we're talking about, it's a way to enter into a story of school segregation. that, though, ended up being probably one of the hardest pieces for me to write. I was, one, trying to balance a lot of things, right? So personal narrative, and then this narrative that's happening in this school, this narrative that's happening in the city, and then this deep history as well. So I really, really struggled in writing that, and with the structure and the proper balance of each one. And then personal things, like when I'm arguing with my husband about where we're going to send our daughter to school, he clearly doesn't expect that conversation to appear in the New York Times one day. And so there was navigating, you know, this is what I want to write. These are, I know we had these conversations, but I have to be honest if I'm going to write the story. And it also gave me really, I think, a great perspective on what we ask our sources to do every day. So I'm controlling the narrative. I can decide what I'll put in and what I won't, but I also feel this tension to be as honest as possible and not just make us look like these great people who didn't have conflict about it. But we're asking our sources to be vulnerable every day, and I don't know that we always consider what that means for them when it comes out in print. Because I can tell you, my husband did get flack for not wanting to enroll his daughter in this black school. And people, some of the parents at my daughter's school felt some type of way about that. And it's just good to always keep in mind that even though people give us permission, even though we feel like we've educated them on what this means, that what we write, and for most people, when we write about them, this is the only time they'll ever be in any publication ever in life. And it's very important that we're careful with that, and I think I got a great perspective. But in general, I don't recommend we spend a lot of time writing about ourselves. It's not hopefully why we get into this.
George, you have the last question. Mike's coming right up.
A great story idea. You could go down to Houston. There's 3 or 4 high schools that the state's fixing to close, and they're trying to figure out how to get them in, and money's not the answer. But anyway, my question's not that, though. I find that many times in the arena of ideas, people who can't compete in that arena use the race card. And so my question to you is the term racist being trivialized is not the right word, but the being overused?
You know what word I think is overused? Race card. I want to get one of these cards. If somebody can tell me where I can find a race card so I can pull it out in the right moment. I feel like race card is a way to really demean the inequality that exists and to act like it's a game to people, and trust me, it's not.
Amen.
We have grave, grave inequality in this country, and the reason why my writing focuses so much on the past is because the inequality we see was very intentionally created, and we are not free of that. You know, I get people all the time who ask me, you know, why do you have to keep bringing up slavery, or why do you have to keep bringing up the past? Actually, I don't even bring up slavery that much, but I'm trying to always get back there in my stories, but can never quite make it. But no one ever asked that about the Constitution, right? No one asked why do we celebrate 4th of July every year, when none of us fought the Revolutionary War, but somehow we want to claim that.
No, it was at the airport.
Right, right. Well, that's, yes, right? So you can't pick and choose which parts of the American legacy you want to claim and deal with, and which parts of the American legacy are inconvenient to the narrative. I don't think, and trust me, somebody tells me I play the race card at least once a week. Again, I want the card. It seems like it could be useful in life. But when you ask that question, and when you think about the posing of the question, is racism overused? Is racist overused? But you had no problem using a racial trope to ask the question, which was the race card, right? So maybe these terms can be overused. I certainly think that there's a certain amount of people who are a bit hyperbolic. I frankly don't care to call someone racist or not. What someone feels in their bones or their hearts or the draws or whatever, I don't care. What I do care about are what are the actions, right? So if you want to look at the White House, do I care if Donald Trump is a racist or not? It is irrelevant to me. What are the actions? And I don't think that it's helpful to throw that word around. But I do think if it applies, if someone, I mean, we know the actual literal definition of racism. If it applies, then we should use it. But I think we need to focus much more on what is the inequality that exists and who is causing the harm, and not worried about putting a label on people. Actions matter. You know, I'll wrap this up. My favorite president in American history is Lyndon B. Johnson. I don't understand why black people have Kennedy on their wall all the time. Kennedy didn't do nothing for black people. Lyndon B. Johnson helped usher through the greatest civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. He used the N-word liberally. Some people would call that man a racist. I don't care. Black people got rights. Black people's material conditions and their lives changed dramatically because of what this man actually did in office, and whether or not he hated black people in their hearts was not relevant to me or my existence. So I think as journalists and as people, we should just focus much more on what people do and a lot less concerned about what people feel or think.
And he was a Texan.
Yep.
And he was a Texan.
And he was a
There you
Texan.
go. We got a question in the back here, and then a question.
You lied
from-
when you said that was the last
I did.
one.
Okay,
You
last
did.
2 questions. We'll wrap it up. Okay.
Okay, I'm from San Francisco. I taught at San Francisco City College for 4 decades, and I pretend to be a writer sometimes. I want to thank you both for your enlightening and inspiring messages, and most of all for your long years and the important struggle for economic and social justice. It's my view that American journalism has failed miserably in criticizing and exposing our ethnocentric, interventionist, never-ending wars. And also, I'm very disappointed that American journalists have not closed ranks in supporting people like Julian Assange. What is your view on those 2 issues? And in the future, do you think Mayborn should invite Seymour Hersh to be a keynote speaker to this event?
Don't look at me.
I'm gonna tell you what, I'm not touching none of that. That's my answer.
Yep. Yep. Thank you. We have
Thank you for your question.
Yes, we have a question from one of our student journalists.
Hello, my name is Imani Kayembe. I'm from the workshop. And this is kind of a question beneath all of us. How can teenagers talk about race but be taken seriously, since we are all under the age of 18?
That is a good question. That is a question for everybody in the room, right? I take teenagers very seriously. I spend my time with a lot of teenagers just because of my reporting. And I've been working and reporting on a group of teenagers in New York City called Teens Take Charge, who are advocating for school integration in New York City. And one of the things that I always remind people is that the civil rights movement was led largely by teenagers, that it wasn't adults. Once you get a mortgage and a job, you're not trying to risk your life for anything. So you guys have a tremendous power, and I wouldn't even be worried about whether adults take you seriously or not. If adults had taken our job seriously, you wouldn't have to be fighting for the things that you're fighting for now. I think what's most important is that you take yourselves seriously, that you comport yourselves in a serious way, that you spend your time doing serious work, that you understand that you actually do have a great deal of power to move the society if you use it in the right way. Don't wait for us. We don't need to bless you with anything. You guys take control, and you guys do the things that you are charged with doing, and you do it well. And those of us who are smart adults will support you in any way that we can.